Good morning, everybody. It's absolutely wonderful to see so many old friends, partners in crime here. I did want to start just by saying a very, very heartfelt thank you to Laura and her team for this enormous job and effort that you put into bringing us all here together, not just to opine on the problem, but really to find solutions, catalyze action at a very, very critical time. And that approach is very much part of ISD's DNA, and so for me it's a great honor to be here as ISD's CEO. My name is Sasha Havlicek, and founder, so that we can work together on some of the challenges that Oren has laid out. ISD, as many of you know, is a global think and do tank, and we've worked now for nearly 2 decades with many of you to detect, to monitor, to mitigate the threats of hate, extremism of all forms, disinformation, working with cities, with practitioners, with communities, with governments to design and to deliver both policy and operational response. I was asked to just say a few words about the evolution of the threat landscape that we're facing based on the research that we've been doing at ISD. Forgive me, there we go. So let me start by saying the obvious, which is the transformation of the extremist landscape has been immense over the past decade. And in place of relatively fringe parochial groups and organizations, we now face large online subcultures able to connect the dots, connecting broad churches, hypercharged by social media, and its amplification of the most divisive and sensationalist content. And they are now increasingly able, as we've seen, to turn that online mobilization into offline action, coalescing around common political objectives. This graphic is a graphic of online accounts showing the increased interaction and mutual reinforcement between both the discourse and the tactics that we've seen of traditional extremist and hate groups, anti-government, culture war, and broader conspiracy networks. And conspiracism, as you all know, has seen this enormous boon during the pandemic, significantly expanding the audiences for hate and extremism. Beyond more traditional extremist ideologies like white supremacy, white nationalism, Salafi jihadism, violent conspiracy movements, incel and manosphere networks, and communities that glorify violence but offer mixed, inconsistent, unclear ideological stances interact in this online space across an increasingly broad set of platforms and products and vie for influence. A weird thing, just an example of that, 5,000 visitors we've just seen this last month to a central Islamic State website have come from incel forums. And these guys are borrowing from each other's tactics and narratives, each other's aesthetics. And increasingly, our research has shown, and others have seen this, Kremlin, Chinese, CCP operations, Iranian information operations have come into the mix. Commercial interests, exploiting and piggybacking off of domestic hate, weaponizing that hate, weaponizing conspiracy in a way that is amplifying both the threat of violence and the threat, frankly, to democracy. This next slide here shows us a little bit of that online bleed of subcultures in the offline world. And as Oren said, the rise in online threats to LGBT communities has absolutely manifested offline. This is a visualization showing the different movements present, this broad church present at LGBTQ demonstrations in the US and the UK from some of ISD's recent research. And much of this, of course, leads to an uptick in violence. What we're really seeing, having seen a mainstreaming of extremism over the past decade, is increasingly the fringe inspired by discourse from the mainstream. And that cyclical inspiration and mobilization has had very serious implications. This graphic here is a breakdown from our own threat detection monitoring and the high-risk briefings that we provide to law enforcement and to communities of the targets of this type of weaponized hate and extremism. And it gives you a sense of that spread that many have talked about, the uptick in attacks against public officials, election workers, election infrastructure, health workers, law enforcement, all of whom, alongside this uptick you see here in LGBT attacks online, increasingly in the line of fire. And of course, we are bracing ourselves for a difficult election year ahead, not just in the US, but elsewhere. And while this type of data is stuff that we find on threats across this broader ecosystem of platforms, it should not distract us from the fact that there are still major problems with the mainstream platforms. And I do want to say this amplification online is part of the threat landscape we must get a handle on. And platform accountability, policy, and action is an absolutely desperately needed piece of the puzzle that we'll talk about, I know, over the coming days. We tend to think that the most extreme is no longer really the problem across those mainstream platforms. Some of this data shows that that's not really the problem, that's not the case. And we see from mapping we've done in many parts of the world, from the UK you see those numbers, on the most hateful, so hate speech, on hateful conspiracism, on extremist and terrorist content, serious reach on mainstream platforms still. A 27% growth of Al-Shabaab and Somali IS Facebook pages membership in the first half of 2022. Over 1 million TikTok views of 20 ISIS accounts in just 2 weeks in July. These are just snippets of research that we've done of late to evidence this. And then, of course, there's the platforms that don't want to be abiding by their own rules anymore. And you have here some of the research we've done lately on the 106% increase in anti-Semitism, 69% increase in pro-ISIS accounts, 69% rise in accounts following known misogynist and abusive accounts on Twitter post-takeover by Musk. Recommendation systems. This is not just that they're not enforcing their own rules. The algorithmic amplification of the stuff that comes closest to the red line is a massive problem, and we see some of the most harmful, potentially dangerous content being targeted at the most susceptible audiences. And that we've seen with everything from abusive hashtags recommended by the likes of Instagram and TikTok in the top 10 search results for people looking for female political candidates, for instance. Women of color coming under absolutely extraordinary attack during election cycles. This is during the midterms here. Content promoting anti-trans, misogynist, manosphere views and recommendations being targeted at young boys and men to clean accounts that we set up. These are some of the really major challenges that we are facing that need to be addressed. Just in terms of the result of all of this, we've talked about the problems of violence, but the problem is a much bigger one. It is impacting civic discourse. It is impacting our opportunity to live in cohesive societies, and liberal democracy is on the line. The attacks that we see from outside, exploiting the divides within, are having a major impact. This is just a picture, the urbanization of politics from across Europe, and gives you a sense of what is afoot. Oren talked about the need for data to drive policy responses. I absolutely agree. But I have to say now that the threat landscape that I've just talked about is also changing for the organizations that do work on this space. And I would be remiss in not saying that the data access that we've enjoyed on certain platforms that we've never had on others is necessary in order to be able to shine a spotlight of transparency on the problems that we face, and in order for us to keep communities safe from threat, democracy safe from attack. That shuttering of data access is going to be a major problem. The hostility that we are seeing coming at us, not only from the extremist ecosystems we work to combat, but also from the mainstream, from political sources, from platforms themselves, is an absolutely critical challenge that we all together need to take on board. So I look forward to working here on the solutions that we need to come together around. Thank you so much for your time.